The potato in my hand weighed more than my phone. I set it down just to be sure I wasn't losing my mind, and when the number finally locked in, I laughed out loud, alone, at 9 in the morning, standing in my kitchen like a man who'd just seen something he couldn't explain. One potato, almost 1.5 pounds. And it didn't come from a farm. It came from a plastic feed bag rotting behind my garage, the kind of thing you'd normally kick out of the way without a second glance. By the end of this, I'm going to show you a pile of potatoes that made my own father-in-law, a man who's grown them for 20 years, stand in my driveway shaking his head like he'd witnessed something he wasn't ready to believe. 41 of them, from 3 seed pieces, out of a torn plastic bag that used to hold livestock feed. But I'm not going to start there, because that number won't mean a thing to you yet. First, you need to know exactly where these instructions came from, because that's the part that convinced me to try something I was almost certain wouldn't work. I want to tell you how that potato happened, but the answer isn't a gardening blog, and it isn't some slick YouTube tutorial. It's an index card, water-stained, handwritten, buried inside a box of recipes that belonged to my wife's grandmother, a woman I never once got to meet. And near the bottom of that box was one card that wasn't a recipe at all. Potatoes the Amish way, no digging. And beneath that title, instructions that read less like gardening advice and more like a riddle someone dared you to solve. Bury the sprouts. Wait, bury them again. Wait longer. Do this 4 or 5 times before you ever expect to see a potato. No spacing measurements. No fertilizer schedule. Nothing but a strange, repeating command, and underneath it, a quiet confidence, as if whoever wrote it never doubted for a second that it would work. My wife is the one who found it, on a Sunday afternoon we'd put off for almost a year, because opening that box meant her grandmother was finally, completely gone. She didn't cry. She just sat there, smiling at handwriting she still recognized after all these years, like an old voice calling from another room. I didn't understand that card at all. Everything I thought I knew about potatoes said you plant them, you wait, you dig. This said something else entirely, and it wouldn't leave me alone. I set the card aside for 2 weeks. I'll admit that much. It contradicted everything I thought I knew, and some stubborn part of me wanted an excuse not to test it. But an idea that keeps interrupting your thoughts isn't one you get to bury forever. So I made myself a deal, standing right there in my kitchen. I'd grown potatoes the ordinary way the year before, decent, forgettable, nothing worth telling anyone about. If this card turned out to be nonsense, I'd lose nothing but a corner of the yard and a few dollars in seed potatoes. But if it wasn't nonsense, if it was true, I'd have proof that a woman I never met had known something the rest of us had somehow forgotten. That was enough. Saturday morning, I decided to find out. I didn't have a proper container, so I grabbed an old feed bag from behind the garage. The thick woven kind livestock feed comes in, and punched a handful of drainage holes into the bottom myself. It wasn't pretty. It looked exactly like what it was, trash being coaxed into becoming something else. I cut 3 seed potatoes into pieces, each one carrying a few healthy eyes, and let them rest overnight the way another gardening book had once instructed, so the wounds could scar over and resist rot. Then I filled the bottom of that feed bag with 6 inches of loose soil, pressed the pieces in with their eyes turned skyward, and covered them with just a couple more inches on top. That was it. That was the entire first step, almost insultingly simple, next to everything else I'd ever read about growing potatoes the correct way. For the first 10 days, nothing happened that seemed worth mentioning. A few pale shoots pierced the surface, thin and uncertain, the way any seedling looks in that early moment before it decides whether it's actually going to commit to living. I nearly forgot about the whole thing. Between work and the rest of the garden, that bag sat quietly in the corner of the yard, easy to overlook beside the tomatoes and peppers that were clearly putting on the better show. Then one afternoon I glanced over and the shoots had climbed to about 7 inches, healthy leaves spread wide at the top, and I remembered the card, "Bury the sprouts." I stood there for a long moment, genuinely torn. Every plant I had ever grown, you nurture the leaves. You protect them. You certainly don't kneel down and deliberately bury them the instant they finally look strong enough to survive. But the card gave me no room to negotiate, so I knelt down and poured soil over those leaves anyway, right up until only the very tips still reached for the sun. It felt like sabotage. It felt like undoing 2 weeks of growth with my own 2 hands on purpose. This is the exact moment when most people would have stopped, certain they'd misread the instructions. I nearly did too. But something in the specificity of that card, "Bury them again, wait longer," made me trust that whoever wrote it knew something I didn't. So I waited. Roughly 12 days later, new growth pushed back through, taller, thicker stemmed, leaves branching wider than before. And I buried it again. This time it felt less like sabotage and more like a ritual I was slowly starting to understand, even if I still couldn't explain why it worked. Here's the part nobody had ever explained to me, the part that quietly rewired how I think about growing food. A potato plant doesn't grow its potatoes from the roots, the way carrots or beets do. It grows them along the buried section of stem, in small swellings called stolons, and those swellings only form when that part of the stem is sealed away in total darkness. Every time you bury the stem a little higher, you're not smothering the plant. You're handing it an entirely new floor to build on, another hidden level, stacked directly above the last. A plant grown in an open row only ever gets one floor, because the stem is buried exactly once, at planting, and never again. After that, it simply climbs into open air, spending all that extra height on nothing more useful than leaves. But bury that stem again and again, and you're essentially asking the plant the same question over and over in the dark. Is there more room up here? Can I keep going? And as long as you keep answering yes, it keeps building. I looked this up afterward, once I finally had a name for what I'd been watching, and the biology behind it turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple once someone spelled it out. Stolons form in darkness because that's their trigger, the same way a seed only wakes up once it senses the right conditions. Light tells the plant to build stems and leaves. Darkness tells it to build storage instead. Every mound, every hilled row, every astonishing harvest throughout history was simply exploiting that same hidden switch, whether the person doing it ever understood the science or not. I buried that bag 4 separate times over the course of the summer, waiting each time for the leaves to reach a decent height before covering them again. By the 4th burial, the bag stood taller than my knee, dense with foliage, and heavier than I expected whenever I had to drag it a few feet to chase the afternoon sun. My father-in-law stopped by sometime in July, spotted the bag, and asked what on earth I was growing in a torn-up feed sack behind the garage. When I told him potatoes, he gave me the exact look I probably would have given someone else, a year earlier. Polite disbelief, the kind reserved for people who mean well but clearly haven't figured out what they're doing yet. I didn't argue with him. There wasn't anything to argue yet. All I had was a strange-looking bag and a stained index card asking me to trust a process I couldn't see happening. That not being able to see it part turned out to be the hardest piece of the entire summer. A tomato plant gives you little previews. Small green fruit slowly deepening in color, quiet, daily confirmation that things are moving the way they should. This gave me nothing. Just leaves and darkness beneath them, and a card that offered no guarantees, only instructions to keep following. More than once that summer, I caught myself standing over that bag at dusk, tempted to push a finger into the soil just far enough to feel whether anything was actually down there. I never did it, partly because I worried about tearing whatever roots had formed, and partly because some stubborn part of me wanted to follow the instructions exactly as written, no shortcuts, the way I imagined she would have done it herself. Late August, the leaves finally began yellowing, curling at the edges, the unmistakable signal every potato-growing guide describes as harvest time arriving. I let it sit another full week anyway, mostly out of nerves, half convinced that rushing it might somehow undo whatever had been quietly happening underground all summer. The morning I finally harvested it, I dragged the bag onto the driveway instead of the lawn, sensing I'd need the hard surface to actually see what I was dealing with. My wife wandered out with her coffee, more curious about all the fuss over a feed bag than genuinely expecting anything. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a driveway right before you learn whether months of trusting a stranger's instructions actually paid off. No music, no conversation, just the dry scrape of woven plastic against concrete as I dragged the bag those last few feet into the sun. I tipped the bag over. The first potatoes to spill out were unremarkable, honestly, medium-sized, the kind you'd expect from any ordinary row. A small twinge of disappointment crept in, like maybe this whole experiment had just been a slightly more entertaining version of an average result. But then I kept digging through the loosened soil, deeper into the bag, and the potatoes started getting bigger, noticeably bigger, and there were more of them than I'd expected, clustered together in a way that made no logical sense for a container that small. By the time I reached the very bottom, where those first seed pieces had gone into the ground back in early spring, I pulled out that one absurd potato, the one that weighed almost 1.5 pounds on its own, more than double the size of anything I'd ever pulled from an open row. I held it up, turning it the same way my father-in-law would later turn it in his own hands, half expecting to find some obvious flaw that would explain how it had grown so large. There wasn't one. It was just a potato, an ordinary potato that had simply been given more room and more darkness than any potato I'd ever grown before. I counted everything once it was all laid out. 41 potatoes, from 3 seed pieces, pulled from a torn-up feed bag that had spent the winter collecting dust behind my garage before that Saturday morning. My wife just stood there, looking at the pile, then back at the bag, like she was running the math in her head and couldn't quite make it add up. She asked if this was normal. I told her honestly that I had no idea because nothing about that summer had felt normal to me either. She picked up the index card from where I'd set it on the porch railing that morning, read it over once more, and said quietly that her grandmother would have loved seeing this. That was the moment the whole thing stopped feeling like a gardening experiment and started feeling like a conversation with someone who wasn't there anymore to have it. I called my father-in-law that afternoon. He was at my house within the hour, which told me more than anything he could have said over the phone. He stood over that pile for a long time, picked up the largest one, turned it over twice in his hands, and finally admitted that after 20 years of growing potatoes in neat, tidy rows, he had never once come close to a harvest like this from the same amount of seed. He asked to see the bag itself, as though he needed physical proof that something this ordinary could have produced something this absurd. He crouched beside it, ran his hand along the torn plastic like he was checking for a hidden seam, a trick, anything that would explain it. There wasn't one. He just knelt there in my driveway, a man who'd spent 20 summers doing this the right way, slowly shaking his head at a torn feed sack that had just made a fool of 2 decades of habit. After he left, the yard settled back into its usual stillness, the way it always does once company's gone and you're left alone with what just happened. I sat at the kitchen table with the potatoes still spread in front of me, and that's when the card stopped being an instruction and started feeling like a message. I laid all 41 potatoes out on the kitchen table that evening, next to that water-stained index card, and just looked at both of them for a while. A woman I never met had written down in handwriting clearly copied and recopied by whoever came before her, a method so simple it seemed almost too modest to matter. Bury the sprouts. Wait. Do it again. No explanation of stolens. No hidden growth zones diagrammed out. She either never knew the biology behind it or never thought it needed explaining, because the results had already convinced whoever wrote it down long before either of us existed. That's the part that still sits with me. This wasn't a technique invented for views or packaged into a course. It was survival knowledge, passed hand to hand, card to card, by people who never had the luxury of a failed harvest. If it worked, you kept it. If it worked well enough, you wrote it down, so your daughter wouldn't have to rediscover it from nothing. And somewhere between her kitchen and mine, most of us stopped writing these things down at all. We started buying answers instead of inheriting them. We assumed that if a method wasn't printed in a store-bought guide, it probably wasn't real or wasn't worth the trouble of trying. I think about how many of these cards must have existed once, scattered across kitchens just like hers, silently outperforming anything sold on a shelf, and how many of them never made it past a single generation. A card gets lost. A house gets sold. A drawer gets cleared out on a Saturday afternoon by someone in a hurry, and nobody thinks to ask the right question before the person who knew the answer is already gone. It's a strange, slow kind of loss, one you don't even notice happening until you're the one standing in a kitchen, holding the last surviving copy of something that used to be common knowledge. It makes me wonder what else got left out of the books we actually kept, the famous ones. The glossy covers, the confident chapter titles, the photographs staged just right. Maybe the real knowledge was never in those books at all. Maybe it was always hiding in the quiet ones, recipe boxes, the margins of old Bibles, the backs of envelopes, written by people who never once considered themselves worth quoting. I think about that assumption every time I walk past that empty feed bag now, still sitting behind the garage, waiting for next spring. Here's what I want you to take from all of this, wherever you're standing right now, maybe looking out at your own small yard and assuming it isn't enough. You don't need acres. You don't need perfect rows or expensive raised beds or a single dollar spent on fertilizer. You need a bag or a bucket or a container with a few holes punched through the bottom, and a handful of seed potatoes that are probably already sprouting in a bin somewhere near you right now, waiting for someone to give them a chance. And you need the willingness to bury something that finally looks like it's succeeding, trusting that covering it up isn't the end of its growth. It's the beginning of the next layer. That's the part most of us struggle with in gardening, and honestly, in most things worth doing. We want proof before we commit. We want to see the potatoes before we're willing to bury the leaves. But every layer that mattered in that bag happened precisely because I couldn't see it happening. I simply had to trust the card, trust the process, and keep going even when nothing looked different from the day before. I think that's true of most worthwhile things, if I'm honest. The parts that actually change the outcome usually happen somewhere you can't watch them, in the stretch where it would be easiest to assume nothing is working and simply give up. The people who wrote cards like this one weren't only teaching a gardening technique. Whether they meant to or not, they were teaching patience, because the method simply refuses to work without it. I don't know who first figured this out. The card doesn't say. Somewhere down a long line of hands I'll never be able to trace, someone stood over a feed sack of their own, probably just as skeptical as I was, and decided to bury the sprouts anyway. And now, generations later, in a driveway 3 states and who knows how many years removed from wherever that idea first began, 41 potatoes rolled out because of it. I still have that index card. It's taped now along the edge because I've handled it so many times the corner started to tear. And tucked behind it in that same recipe box, there was another card I nearly missed entirely, folded in half, in a different handwriting altogether. This one wasn't about potatoes at all. It mentioned drying beans on the vine, a method for storing them through an entire winter without a single mason jar involved, using nothing but the pods themselves and a cool, dark corner of a cellar. I haven't opened that card fully yet. I've been almost superstitious about it, the way you might hold off on the final page of a book you don't want to finish. Part of me wonders whose handwriting it actually is, her mother's, an aunt's, a neighbor's, someone who traded recipes back and forth the way people used to, long before any of this lived on a screen. And part of me wonders how many more cards like it are still out there right now, sitting in boxes nobody has opened yet, waiting for someone curious enough to finally read past the recipes. But next time, I'm going to open it. Because if one water-stained card about potatoes could hand me 41 of them from a torn feed bag, I have absolutely no idea what a second card, written by that same careful hand, might be about to teach me.